Student Union for inviting me here at the very last minute. And I'll keep my talk brief so that we can have more discussion, because I can understand that sitting for 3 to 4 hours can give you problems, and at least I'm having neck ache now, partly because I traveled only today morning. Now, first thing I'll start with is, one of my Kashmiri friend, he wanted to come to listen to me. He wanted to come to listen to me because he knew, or he felt, that when I'm talking of Azadi, when I'm talking of freedom, I would not exclude talking about freedom for Kashmiris, right? So that he wanted to come. But he said that he didn't want to come because he was warned that he should not go to JNU at this moment, because it could get quite tricky for him. Now, what's the truth of the matter? I'll not talk of it. But there is a sense amongst many Kashmiris, for instance, Kashmiri students in Delhi, that they have to lie low for the time being, because the things they could say in 2013, for instance, 2014, they should be more careful now with what had happened with some of your own fellow students. I thought I'll start with that. Now, so to remind us, so in a sense, India is supposed to be a democracy. India claims that Kashmir is an integral part of India, and yet Kashmiris are seen as someone who's always forever with suspicion. So we have to keep that in mind, and that is the kind of democracy we talk about here. Now, when I entered here, because I wasn't sure how to plan my lecture and how to talk about it, but one of the posters I saw, which would be, I guess, ABVP, which says, as you can predict, that organization, I'll not name it, but it says, Kashmir se Kanyakumari, Bharat Mata ek hamari. Now, it's very interesting, but not surprising, that there's an anthropomorphization of nationalism. So India becomes Bharat Mata, so Mother India. So if you then try to say that, okay, maybe Kashmiri should have right to self-determination, then you're practically saying that you should be allowed to chop off the head of that Bharat Mata, right? So then it becomes very visceral, very emotional, and how could anyone who respects mothers would talk about disrespecting Mother India, right? So there's an anthropomorphization. And that is a form of nationalism we are talking about, which is a very reactionary nationalism. But of course, non-reactionary nationalism also talks of Bharat Mata. But at least in their case, it's very clear. Kashmiris don't matter. You can kill, you can torture, you can rape, you can disappear, and you can completely neglect Kashmiris. But Kashmiri is part or integral part of that Bharat Mata. So, right? So in a sense, what we find very curious with this reactionary nationalism is, on one level, there's this personhood given to Indian nation. On the other hand, you have complete suppression of human rights and right to self-determination of an entire people living in Jammu and Kashmir. That's the double move, right? Now, this is with the reactionary nationalism, and you could see that why they would support, and actually they support, and even they're very active with colonization of Kashmir. And I'll talk of colonization later, why I call it colonization. But second poster I saw, which I think is SFI, because it did talk of, yeah, it's SFI. It has a poster here, right now I saw it. It says a picture of, I think, Britannica or something. I claim this land in the name of His Majesty, right? So it's sort of imperialism. And the IMF poster is next to it, which also talks of how IMF also colonizes. So talking about similarity between colonialism and neo-colonialism. So colonialism of the British kind in India, and neo-colonialism of the kind that IMF, for instance, perpetrates. I was wondering to what extent, and we are talking of SFI, so progressive nationalism, because they claim to be also Indian nationalist, right? So progressive nationalism also could have used example of Indians being in Kashmir and saying, we have liberated Kashmir, or we saved Kashmir from Islamists, or we have saved Kashmir from those dangerous Pakistanis. You could take example of China, China in Tibet, China in Xinjiang, where China, which is Communist Party ruled, of course, which claims that it has liberated Tibet, it has liberated Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And yet, I have not come across many, there are few, but I have not come across many progressive left nationalists also who would usually try to talk about China as a colonizer or India as a colonizer, even though when we try to understand the experience of Kashmiris or experience of Uyghur Muslims in China or experience of Tibetans in China and Kashmiris in Indian context, what you find is very clearly experience of being colonized. Now, why do I, in my work, I look at colonization. What is colonization? And let's not forget Kashmir and forget Tibet. Let's talk about colonization of the British kind in here, or I'm not talking of even neo-colonialism. I'm not talking of neo-imperialism. I'm talking of traditional colonization of the European kind. Colonization is first and foremost about asymmetry of power. It is when where I colonize you would imply that I would always have the upper hand to name you and decide your identity, right? In that context, the relation would be never of equality, but relation would be of inequality. Colonization is about territorial control, so it's about control over alien territory. Colonization is about control over alien people, people that you have to domesticate, but you can never trust fully. That's part of colonization. Colonization is about development used as a mechanism of control. So you build roads, you build railways, but they're always to control first and foremost. Colonization is about cultural transformation. Colonization is about production of knowledge. For those of you who had studied post-colonial theory, Edward Said, Fanon and others, colonization has always gone hand in hand with production of knowledge about the other, where the other is seen as not capable of producing knowledge about themselves, and other is produced in a manner where they have to be ruled, they cannot rule themselves. Right? There's a production of knowledge about the other. Colonization is in the end about militarization, and colonization of course is about violence. Now when we take example of Indian rule in Kashmir, I would argue, and that I've argued in my work and I continue to argue, that all the aspects of traditional colonization is present. Kashmir is an integral part of India, but Kashmiris have no right to decide whether they can be or they want to be integral part of India or not. Now when we say integral part, it's not only that it's part of India, but it's an essential part of India. So if Kashmir is somehow not part of India, then India cannot be India. So in a sense, it's like, I would use, I know it's an analogy which doesn't fully work, but you could imagine. Concept of marital rape, which of course Indian government doesn't recognize, so that's another problem. But concept of domestic abuse or domestic relation where the partner who does not want to be partner is forced to be a partner because the dominant partner wants the other person to be a partner. So when we take example of Kashmir, and I'm using that an analogy which is largely gendered, what you find is Kashmir is seen as integral part of India, where Kashmiris have no right to decide they want to be part of India or not. If that is not colonization, then I don't think what else could be colonization. That's very clear, right? So in a sense, it's about asymmetry of power. Kashmiris cannot decide what they want for themselves. So image of Kashmir would be a beautiful land with beautiful people, or beautiful land with ugly people who cannot be trusted, beautiful land with Muslim people majority who cannot be trusted because they're Muslims or they're pro-Pakistan, or Kashmiris who are so innocent that they get fooled by Pakistan, otherwise they would have loved India, right? So that's how it's seen. So Kashmiri political agencies almost completely erased. The aspect of alien territorial control. I mean, when you look at an example of Indian map, right? You all are familiar with Indian map. That's a lie. And that's very clearly a lie, and all of you know it's a lie. Because even if you take example of the real map, of course there is no real map, but let's say real map would say Pakistan control Kashmir, Indian control Kashmir, Chinese control Kashmir. That would be realistic. If you don't want to call it Pakistan occupied, Indian occupied and Chinese occupied, even if you want to call administered or control, you at least there should be honesty to call it what it is. But on Indian map, and which is a legal map, because if you go against that map, that you go against the law. And that law was not brought by BJP, was not brought by Hindu right. It was brought by the secular nationalists. So when we see example of Kashmir, we know that there's hardly any difference between secular nationalism and Hindu nationalism. Now, going back to the map, so Indian state, Indian nationalism wants us to stick to that fabrication where on map you would think that you're going from Srinagar to Mirpur or somewhere, but in reality you cannot cross because it is line of actual control. So in a sense you could see there's an alien territorial control, and the way in which Indian state justifies that heavy militarization, which is of course the most heavily militarized place in the world, justifies it by saying it's part of it, but of course we face danger from Pakistan. Right? So again, but it is about alien political control, alien territorial control. Those of you who are from Kashmir, some of you, those who have been to Kashmir, you would notice that the way in which with very pride you find Indian military, Indian paramilitary. Now one thing to keep in mind is, if you say there's a lot of Indian military in Kashmir, a common response from Indian nationalists would be that, oh, it's not military, So it's ITBP, it's BSF, it's someone else. But of course, from Kashmiri perspective, even Jammu Kashmir police, that would be Kashmiri, is also part of the Indian militarization, because all of them are heavily militarized. And I recall a particular board, I think it was near Baramulla, which says, Azadi ke Prahari. Now, Azadi ke Prahari were the Indian military. That is the only place where it seems that Indian government is fine with using the word Azadi legally in Kashmir, which is used by the colonizing military force. But you find that the entire landscape of Kashmir is populated by populated by military. Right? So that's there. Then you have got control over people, and that's again, Kashmir is treated with suspicion, always, all the time. So while I said Kashmir is an integral part, Kashmir would always be seen with suspicion, and that has how it has happened since 1950s. The only role Kashmiris can play is to forever thank India to an extent, right? And I'll come to Tibet later because it's even worse to an extent there in this regard. Economic control, one of the common image in India of Kashmir is of, that basically they're quite lazy, they don't work hard, India is investing heavily in Kashmir, when in reality, what India extracts out of Kashmir is much more than what it gives it. So the economic control is also very high. Keep in mind that in 1947, what is Jammu and Kashmir was not dependent largely upon what is India. Even with trade, it was more dependent on what is Pakistan today. Right? So it's very clear, therefore, that economic dependence of Kashmir today is, again, a part and parcel of colonial mechanism of control. So that we have to understand. So it's not a natural dependence. Take example of production of knowledge. Indian academics, when they write about Kashmir, most Indian academics don't talk about Kashmir. Right? They don't write about Kashmir. But even when they write, not all, of course, there are exceptions, but most of them would not talk of Kashmir the way they would talk of other colonial places. They will talk of Palestine and rights of Palestine, but they would almost never talk of Kashmir. But even when they write, they would focus on like the government rhetoric. You know, the Sarat Bijli Pani, what do you young people want? That's one production of knowledge. Bollywood movies, in the past they would produce Kashmir as this completely depoliticized and apolitical landscape. And now, of course, Kashmir are those who are potential terrorists, who are, of course, also many of them innocent, many of them terrorists. That is part and parcel of the production of knowledge in Bollywood. When you look at advertisements, again, advertisements are rather very naive, where Kashmiris are seen as, again, innocent, too innocent. So there's this ad, remember this Olex ad, where a particular military person and Kashmiri person, or Kashmiri man and military man, they become friends, right? They become friends. Of course, in that scene, what you have is the Kashmiri man running up to the camp to give a new phone to the military man. Of course, in reality, if any young Kashmiri man goes, he will be shot, for sure. But at least in ad, they can go and run. And they become friends. And what they show in the second version of the ad is that the Kashmiri guy is very much into selfies. And of course, the Indian military person is looking at him with very deep paternalistic look. Because I'm saying paternalism because paternalism is also very much part of colonial control. And that is what functions there. Right. Media, we saw, I mean, I've used example of, in my work, I'm looking at the flood part, flood in 2014. Most of the media reporting, I mean, and I say Indian media is a national media, but it's actually a nationalist media. It's not national media. It's very much nationalist, and we have seen that with the JNU controversy also. They become more nationalist than the government themselves. Sometimes I've wondered that the khaki chaddi people are easier to identify, and they're less dangerous than those like Arnab Goswami, who may not, well, I don't know what chaddi he wears, by the way. Maybe, let's assume he wears Calvin Klein white underwear, I don't care. But the reality is, people like them are even more dangerous and lethal than the khaki chaddi ones. And in a sense, that is what we have to look at also. Because they produce certain versions of nationalism which does not allow any dissent. And on Kashmir is an easy target, and that is why they focus on it. Right? So the knowledge production of Kashmir in Indian media during the time of floods was very clear that Kashmiris, of course, Indian, and I've collected that, I have analyzed that also, I'm analyzing it, and other people have done the same, that it's about rescuing. So constant stories of Indian army rescuing Kashmiris. And then, why do Kashmiris still hate Indians, right, or Indian army? So not even Indian army, because there's still no evidence of Kashmiris hating Indian people in general. Right? But it is more, and in that they're remarkably patient. Because if any other country had ruled them the way India has ruled Kashmir, they would have started hating majority of Indians. But I have not come across much of evidence where there's a popular hatred against Indians. It's more about hatred of Indian state and Indian nationalism to an extent. So knowledge production is very much clear there. And in that context, I do think even post-colonial scholars, right? I'm talking of scholars who have been very much aware and in forefront internationally of talking of, let's say, how Western influence has shaped knowledge production of the world, have questioned hierarchies, who have questioned Orientalism, and I'm talking of people who may have even come and spoken here in the past, and yet, and I can understand why today many of you or many of us may be careful in talking about Azadi for Kashmir. Right? I can understand because it becomes difficult. You don't want to be charged with sedition. You don't want to lose your job. You don't want to lose your access to the country. Right? All those things I understand. So maybe people are anxious. But what about 1990s? What about early 2000s? When the human rights abuse was at its maximum. I'm not aware of the post-colonial scholars, and I'm talking people like Partha Chatterjee. Right? I'm talking to him, I'm talking Gajal Spivak, Homi Bhabha. I'm not aware of what they were talking about when they could identify how West has colonized the non-West, but not when non-West has colonized the non-West. And for me, that is part and parcel of problem of not only post-colonial theory, but also a lot of Marxist thinking, left thinking, where somehow it's only the white people who have the capacity to colonize. The non-white can never colonize. Or if they can colonize, they're colonizing simply because they're being influenced by the white. The reality is, in case of Kashmir, and I could talk of Tibet also because that's I've worked on even more, the colonization of Kashmir and the colonization of Kashmiris by India is not a remnant of or not a residue from the past of British rule in India. It is an active constituent of the present state of India. Right? So that we have to keep in mind, and that is colonization. Now again, militarization, I don't think I will need to go because at least progressive nationalists in India, I'm not talking of reactionary nationalists who love violence, right? And even indulging violence. Even progressive nationalists have acknowledged and recognized the ways in which violence is integral to Indian rule in Kashmir. In fact, I've argued that it is not Kashmir that is an integral part of India, it is violence that is integral to Indian rule in Kashmir. The violence of the kind where killing, I said that's simple or easy, we know it's killing takes place, torture, rape, I'm talking mass rape, I'm talking sexual torture also, right? And then of course disappearance. 8 to 10,000 people have been disappeared by the state, and I'm not talking of people who could have gone on the other side and no one knows. I'm talking of people even where Indian military or paramilitary acknowledge that they have gone somewhere and they offer compensation, right? But not a single case has been brought to the court to full extent because, as you know, AFSPA implies, in case of Kashmir and of course parts of northeastern India, and see what I'm talking of Kashmir, as you know with Iram Sharmila and her struggle, we know it also takes place in other parts, but I'm focusing Kashmir. What you find with AFSPA, of course, is that Indian state, judiciary, Indian state is supposed to be democracy, I say supposed to be, right? You have legislature, you have executive, you have court. So all of them are supposed to balance each other. So the Supreme Court also has said that basically there are enough mechanisms in place to make sure that law is properly followed. When we take example of AFSPA, AFSPA does have that requirement where if the state government, the provincial government wants to prosecute someone for human rights abuses under AFSPA, right, protect under AFSPA, they have to seek permission from Ministry of Home Affairs in case of paramilitary and Ministry of Defense in case of Indian military. So there is that provision, right? So there is rule of law. Except since 1990, not a single permission has been granted by Indian government. So you could see therefore that there's provision under rule of law, but in practice it remains completely without justice. So we are talking therefore of all kinds of violence being perpetrated on the bodies of Kashmiris. And Kashmir is one of the rare examples, I would say, where that not only the not only the living body is controlled, not only the dead bodies become dead and lives are taken away, but in case of Afzal Guru and in case of Maqbul Bhatt, in both those cases, even the dead bodies were not given back to the people. They were not given back because, in a sense, India wants to make it very clear. Now, the rationale could be that, oh, if you give the dead bodies back, then it becomes center of protest and everything. Well, the reality is there are graves everywhere in Kashmir, and Kashmiris don't need any site of protest. They can protest anywhere against India. It's more about giving a message to Kashmiris that we not only control you when you live, but we also control you, and we can control you even after you're dead. And that is a kind of necropolitics of Kashmir that we are talking about, necropolitics of Indian, or rather Indian occupation Kashmir. Right? Militarization there, we can expand that. Take example of, India is not unique. That's very clear. And in my own work, I've looked at China and Tibet, China with Uyghurs, very similar kind of language of liberation, language of territorial control, language of occupation, right? But of course, occupation is called liberation. You can't call occupation there. You have got denial of human rights. In case of China, of course, not only the living bodies are controlled, even reincarnation is supposed to be controlled. So now we have a situation where an atheist government, it is an atheist government, right? Those of you who might be Maoist, I mean, you should be laughing at the kind of examples you have. And a gentleman earlier who talked about Mao and his ideas of social reform, very interesting that even during Cultural Revolution, all olds were challenged. Remember, all old ideas, old tradition, except Mao himself. Mao could not be challenged. So sacred could be challenged, but Mao became sacralized there. In case of Tibet, what you find is that even the atheist Communist Party claims that the Dalai Lama has no right not to reincarnate. So even they will control the manifestation, because there's no concept of soul, it's manifestation. So even after death, the Communist Party argue that it is sole authority in controlling the manifestation. So I'm just giving you examples here. You take example of Kurdish people. In Turkey and other places, you have similar kind of dynamics. You take example Baloch in Pakistan, similar dynamics of, I said, asymmetrical power relation, territorial control, alienating people, racialization of people, ethnicization of people, taking away political agency, knowledge production, and all of that, right? So what we find, therefore, is that the post-colonial world has its own version of colonialism, which is not that different from what it had experienced. Now, where does it come from? And if I take example of India per se and India and Kashmir, it comes from nationalism. So the reality is, Indian nationalism has a myth that Indian nationalism, in a sense, is a reaction to, it was an anti-colonial nationalism. But anti-colonial nationalism also leads to a situation where you have got this fetishized version of the white British were very problematic, and of course the Browns who take control and who can manage. But the reality is, the Indian state that emerged in 1947 was a successor state to British India. And with that successor state, not only came the bureaucracy, it also came the claims. The difference with British would be, the British drew lines on the map often. The Indians and the Chinese drew lines, and Pakistanis, they drew lines on the ground and over the bodies. So in a sense, the Indian, Pakistani and Chinese state in the region are even more colonial than what the British had done, because the British version of colonialism still had some ambiguity there. And we see that also with the tribals in central India, where British at least left them to their own accord in most cases, not all cases, most cases, but the Indians have gone on and colonized them even further. Now, the challenge, of course, is that how to link, and in my own work I'm looking at, so I'm more than happy to answer questions, criticism, or even ideas for the future. The way I see is that it is that post-colonial nationalism which believes that we were victims, so we were great powers, and then we were victims of colonization. And we were victims of colonization because we were not united. And because, of course, you had alien powers trying to control us. And being victimization, so that victimization paradigm also engenders a sense of paranoia and insecurity about any dissent. And it also engenders a sense of pride which does not allow any criticism. So what I would therefore argue is that it is experience of being colonized that has made the Indian nationalists or Chinese nationalists or Pakistani nationalists even more colonial than what they would have been. So rather than learning from the own experience of being colonized, they have become more colonial. They become more colonial because they believe that if they are not colonial, then the state would collapse, right? They would become weak. So we have ended up in a situation where, even though during Indian independence movement or freedom movement or what a nationalist movement, you could see very clearly there were talks about, and the rationale was, we need some form of democracy. Nationalism, I'm not aware that, does Constitution have the word nationalism? I would be nationalism? No, it has the word democracy. So democracy is more important than nationalism. And yet, we take example of real existing democracy in India is where it is all but democracy. It's all about nationalism. So everything can be trumped, people can be killed, people can be arrested, people can be excluded, people can be bullied, people can be beaten up, all in the name of nation. When Indian Constitution, for instance, makes it very clear that it's about other things apart from, including democracy. So democracy is the ideal. Now, of course, one of the things is how to tackle question of Azadi within this setup. Azadi in, let's say, post-colonial setup was very clearly an idea of, it was an anti-colonial idea. Azadi from whom? Azadi for whom? All those ideas were there, right? So it was recognized that political freedom in itself is not enough. You need economic freedom, social freedom, and other kinds of freedom. But talking about other kinds of freedom did not imply that you don't need political freedom. It would be doing disservice to ourselves and disservice to the entire idea of Azadi if we reduce Azadi only to economic freedom, only to social freedom, only to religious freedom, and only to political freedom within certain limits set by the state. Because in reality, as I said, the principle behind Azadi was basically anti-colonial, to decolonize everyone. Since 1950s, for instance, parts of progressive left that challenged this idea of decolonization argued that it's not enough to have this political freedom, political Azadi, we also need other forms of Azadi. But they never said that political Azadi is not important. Now, when we take it back to Kashmir, and Kashmiri case, or Balochistan or Kurdistan, all three use Azadi, by the way, right? So no one has exclusive purchase on it, no doubt, but we have to respect that each movement has used Azadi in its own ways. And you take example of Tibet also, what we find is that if we argue that Azadi is essentially freedom within constitution, freedom within the existing state, then we are doing disservice. We are doing disservice because we are denying them right to self-determination. We may say that we would want Kashmir to be part of us. I'm not talking of reactionary nationalists, I'm talking of progressive nationalists, right? We can say we would ideally want Kashmir to be part of us, but for that, of course, we will have to make sure then if we claim that we want Kashmiris to be part of India, then the first and foremost, we have to make sure, and we have to be loudest when it comes to human rights abuse in Kashmir, and we have to fight against it. And we have to make sure that human rights abuses are not committed in the name of Kashmir being an integral part of India. We can say that this is what we want. But what we can't say and what we don't have the right to say is that this is what Kashmir should have. Because in the end, it is for Kashmiris to decide whether they want freedom within India, freedom from India, or no freedom at all. And that is at the heart, right to self-determination. So very clearly, if you're talking of Azadi, and if you're having Azadi kind of discussion, we have to respect, in the end, the choice made by people, which is very simple in international law terms, right to self-determination. Let them decide. If we start preaching what they should have, I may have my own views, that's different, right? But if we start imposing our views on them and start allowing for their dehumanization on the grounds that they're asking for Azadi, which is different from the Azadi we want, that would become problematic. Now, often we come across, and have come across that, to be honest, I don't really believe in nationalism, I don't believe in state, and therefore even with national, I get queasy, right? So I support stateless nations, I don't support integrity of any existing nation state, because nation states by the very nature are very violent and very coercive. But for someone like me, with privileges, with passport, with a stated identity, it's very easy to say, oh, you should not talk about state, you should not talk of nation state because this is passé. Let's talk of progressive freedom of all kind. But I'm sorry, given that international relations privileges sovereign statehood and certain ideas of nation state as most important, and your rights are derived through your membership of nation state, as progressives, we have no option but to support that right to self-determination if that includes, and I said, if that includes transformation of existing states, so be it. Because we have to keep in mind, no empire, no state has lived forever. And therefore, using the existing state, existing boundaries to dehumanize people is the most unethical politics that may be followed. So to conclude, and I conclude, for me, when we talk, me, and I'm sure hopefully for many of you, even I said, if whatever our conception of Azadi is, even if we feel that, let's say, if we are Indians, if we feel we are Indians, or we believe in idea of India, very problem. But if we believe in idea of India, and we believe somehow that India can escape casteism and still be progressive, it can escape racism, still be progressive, it can escape colonization, it can still be progressive. If you believe in that, that's fine. But we have to acknowledge that our first and foremost role is not to side with or end up siding with the reactionary nationalists in allowing, in this case, Kashmiris to be excluded. Because the reality is there can be no democracy, there can be no Azadi in India without Azadi for Kashmiris, and Azadi for Kashmiris includes I said, right of Kashmir to decide whether they want to be part of India, part of Pakistan, part of China, part of Uzbekistan, or independent on their own, or nothing else. So in that sense, I'll conclude with that argument that Azadi, therefore, is very much about respecting the other, not imposing our ideas. And it would be sad if progressive nationalism starts becoming like reaction nationalism. And in the end, I do hope that many of you think seriously about it. I'm sure you are here, so you're possibly already thinking seriously about these issues. But whatever the state does, and it's a fascist state, we know it's not fascistic, it's fascist in a very clear sense. They will, of course, challenge us in every way possible. But at the very least we can do is, if we can't support Azadi for Kashmiris, what we have to make clear that we should not say things that go against Azadi for Kashmiris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. If you have any questions, then keep your...
The most difficult question is how to establish the choice of the Kashmiri people into reality. Do we need a mediator, or how can it be possible? Please put your comments. This is the most difficult question, and I do support your views that it is the people of the Kashmir who will decide their future. We always talk the Kashmiris are integral part, but never in the train and buses I never hear that Kashmiri people are integral part, and that is the fundamental difference lies here. So please.
Very please, thank you very much. That's true. I said Kashmir is integral part, not Kashmiris. Kashmir is only integral when it comes to committing violence against them or appropriating their lives for the idea of Indian state. Very briefly, again, said the UN resolution is not the solution, because UN resolution, this is in 1947-48, both India and Pakistan colluded in making sure that in UN resolution there is no third option of independence. And that is where India and Pakistan come together, by the way. If you look at a constitution of the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and if you look at constitution of Pakistan occupied so-called Azad Jammu and Kashmir, both are very similar. Both do not allow for anything other than perpetual part of being India or Pakistan. Right? That's what they had done. For me, it's very simple. It could be simple. Starting with Indian state, and this is where I think our role comes up, or those of us who are seen as part of India and everything, our role comes with that, making sure that the rights that are given to Kashmir, even within Indian constitution, is respected and they're provided. Provide justice to what happened in 1990s, because there can be no moving on without justice. People say, oh, people should move on, it happened 25 years ago. Women who are waiting for the sons to come back, women who are waiting for the husbands to come back for 20, 25 years, you can't go and tell them just move on, because there can be no moving on without justice, right? Provide justice within the setup, and maybe Indian state could do is that, okay, in 50 years time or 30 years time, I'm being very generous, 30 to 50 years time, we will have a proper referendum. In the meantime, give us opportunity, we'll do our level best to make sure that everything within the constitution is provided to you. After 50 years, we'll have a referendum in entire Jammu and Kashmir, and of course not Kashmir only, by the way, Jammu and Kashmir, including Pandits, including people in Jammu, Gilgit, Baltistan, everywhere, right? Then you have a referendum which would have to be conducted by a neutral party, even that could be United Nations, something, but India could promise that. The problem is Indian position is such a dubious and dodgy one that India took Kashmir to United Nations while acknowledging that it's an internationally disputed territory. To the world community, it says it's a dispute now between India and Pakistan, but to its own people it says it's not disputed. So Kashmir belongs to India. So now you have to think that it's a schizophrenic state into three splits personalities, that it's a dispute, it's not a dispute, it is integral part of India, no, it's between India and Pakistan. So the problem, of course, is the state broadly, and I think the solution would be practically to provide rights first, and then promise and have a credible referendum in the future and allow people of Jammu and Kashmir to make their own decision. Now, if the question is, what would Pakistan do, what if it does something, that comes later. That comes later, because if I believe that if India does show that kind of maturity, which I don't think it would, but at least if it shows a certain kind of maturity, I'm sure that even Pakistan would be under pressure to do something along the same lines.
About Afzal Guru, I mean, can you please tell me your opinion about Afzal Guru?
Now, basic element is, of course, there are different controversies, whether Afzal Guru is involved or not and everything. Those arguments are there, right? So there's a question about to what extent it was a judicial murder, to what extent he was a normal person who was made into hero because of Indian state killing him and everything, right? So there's one about Afzal Guru, right? And I would not talk of him personally, right? In terms of, because I would not know exactly what was gone, but very clearly there's strong evidence that the grounds on which he was captured, the grounds on which he was convicted, and the grounds on which he was executed, all those grounds leave a lot of room for doubt. And that itself shows that basically the capital punishment against him was a judicial murder. I thought that was a very simple thing to accept. Now, of course, there could be people who believe in capital punishment. There could be people who like judicial murder. You know, many people love murder, and that's a fact. So the Indian state could have simply said, we like killing people and do it. But they could have sort of avoided this facade of judicial process. But what has happened is Afzal Guru has become bigger than what it is, or what he was in life. So for instance, for Kashmiris, he becomes a martyr once he's killed by the state. The reality is, given the state of occupation of Kashmiris and given the absence or the suppression of dignified life of Kashmiris under the Indian rule, what you will have is anybody, any person, any entity that's criticized or punished by India could become hero there. Right? And I'll give you an example of, people talk of this ISIS flag in Kashmir. You may have heard of it. That in Indian media highlighting ISIS flag or Pakistan flag. Well, Pakistan flag was almost always there because Pakistan is part and parcel of it, right? Now, if Indian state can plant Indian flag there, so why not people could use Pakistan? That's what they're doing. Now, ISIS flag is a very interesting phenomenon because for before Modi, the fascist prime minister, decided to have some kind of bromance with Nawaz Sharif, right? Before that, what we found was very clearly Indian media highlighting ISIS flag. Now, in Kashmiri state is one where almost every aspect of life is under surveillance, if not fully controlled. Okay? Now, ISIS flag, in many cases I had noticed, was sort of unfurled in similar place in downtown by similar looking guys. Police knew where it is. Media people know where it is. But police never made any effort to capture them. Because the way I see it is because ISIS bogey or even Pakistan bogey plays a very crucial role for India to highlight to Indians that the movement in Kashmir is not for self-determination. Movement in Kashmir is not for dignity, not for human rights. It is essentially a pro-Pakistan, a pro-ISIS movement in which is, of course, you'd say, how can we sort of support it, right? So in a sense, Indian state invests heavily not only in colonizing Kashmir, it's investing heavily in colonizing the Indian minds because they know that the Azadi for Kashmiris would also imply Azadi for Indian minds.
So there is one question which is slightly tangential to what you asked, but then this culture of commemoration that is very rife in every shade of politics that we see. The right does it, the left does it, everyone does it. And leftists will hate me for saying this, but then why is the Kashmiri commemoration so much problematic we can understand for the right, but for the left also? Because we know that there are martyrs of the left which are celebrated even in this campus. So it ultimately comes down to why does, I'm not talking about what happened on February 9th here, but then why is commemoration of Afzal Guru seen something so explosive and something so condemnable?
I mean, the problem again, without going into we all have problems. We all have our own hypocrisy. I'm sure I have my own, and I know what my hypocrisies are. But we all have our own hypocrisies, our own blind spots, our own selective outrage, select empathy. Those things are part and parcel of life. But broadly speaking, when we look at left in India, and I'm talking the mainstream left, let's say, or even not so mainstream left, the problem with mainstream left is that the kind of debates I've come across, and because I've worked on Tibet a lot, and I see myself as left, I see myself as progressive. And I remember 2 years ago, I think I was speaking to Tibetan students here saying or maybe 3 years ago, why Tibet should be a left issue, Indian left issue, not an Indian right issue. So it's very easy to say why Dalai Lama is praising RSS, why is VHP involved in amongst Tibetans. But the bigger question is not them, because they're refugees. The kind of discrimination and kind of insecurity that Tibetans face in India, being refugees, if you don't know, then partly because you don't know, but in essence, when we have looked at it, we know it's a very precarious life. The state of being refugee is even sort of more dangerous and more precarious than the state of being occupied to an extent, right? That's here. That is, why has Indian left been quiet? Because Indian left, mainstream left partly, has largely followed certain kinds of lines. So if China says something or China model is good, then it is great. And when China kills, commits genocide, again rapes, tortures and everything, we have to keep silent because only the capitalists can be imperialist. Now, take example of even communism as an idea. One aspect of communism is false consciousness, which is what? Workers don't know what's good for them. So we have to transform them. So who knows? It's the avant-garde party. Right? So it's a vanguard party, so which will sort of look at that. Now, if that is also not a remnant of imperialism, I don't know what it is. Because imperialism is about, you don't know what's good for you, I will liberate you. And sadly, that is what also parts of communism has done, because people don't know what's good for themselves, so let's talk about them. Now, coming to your question directly about commemoration and other things, the reality is, I said, there can be no ethical left position. There can be, I can see there can be strategic left position that keeps quiet on Kashmir. Strategic because you don't want to be arrested, you want to be meaningful, you assume that all Indians are very deeply parochial nationalists and all Indians would support killing and suppressing of Kashmiris. But there can be strategic silence. But there can be no ethical grounds on which the left or progressives could say that, oh, we should commemorate our own martyrs, but not see. Let's say Afzal Guru, fine, he was, and he could say, he did not produce a lot of writing while he was there and everything. Take Maqbul Bhatt. Maqbul Bhatt was hanged by India in mid-1980s. Maqbul Bhatt talked of Azadi of the kind that, I mean, I don't think even we discussed that here, which is Azadi that included independence of Kashmir from both India and Pakistan, and he was punished by both India and Pakistan, though killed by India in the end. He also talked of social justice. He said there can be no Azadi without economic justice. He talked of all forms of justice, right? Now, if Maqbul Bhatt, who was killed by Indian state, he should be an ideal model for the left here. But why is the left silent? Because tragically, I think the left has also bought into the nationalist myth, which is that India, which we have, is somehow sacrosanct, and left has gone and failed in ideas of socialism, which was very clear. Remember, before Stalin, the left has adopted the Stalinist idea of socialism in one country rather than Trotskyite, Leninist, or even Marxist idea where you cannot have socialism in one country because socialism involves permanent revolution and it involves solidarity with the people who are not close to you.
I have to kind of congratulate you that you have put the freedom back to the freedom square. And coming to the question of one of the pioneers of anti-colonialism, Frantz Fanon. So all the orders in place that are the judiciary, the legislative and the executive all colluding and forming a sort of trio that murders, and it's a sort of a very necropolitic state, nation state that is in existence. So all the channels failing for the common citizen or the Aam Aadmi. So how would you situate Frantz Fanon's advocacy of violence within the anti-colonialist framework? So is there a possibility of some sort of violence? Of course, the state has the prerogative and it is supposed to do violence to keep its power in place. So how does the citizen or the last man, where he also says the last shall be the first, so how does this framework get subverted? So otherwise there is, we are all going round and round. We are just reacting to all the state imaginations of the state. So there is nothing concrete coming around. So all of we are just caught in this play of a merry-go-round. So what is the contextualization of violence in this context for us?
Thank you very much. I mean, in a sense, if we start talking of legitimacy of violence, of course, the state is already there, but non-state, you can see how tricky it starts getting. Then people start saying, oh, so you're supporting violence, supporting everything. The reality is, majority of people support violence. Majority support violence of the state. The police, the paramilitary, as you pointed out. The state uses terror. State uses terrorism. So in a sense, terrorism is already part of the Kashmir discourse because the Indian state uses it most effectively. Not fully effectively, but most effectively. The only thing it has not managed to control is the mind of the people. But what it has done, and this is what Indian state has been very clever at doing it. Remember, it's a sly Brahminical state. In a sense, the Indian state is sort of successor state to not only the British, who is sly, but also the Mughals who were also sly, and much longer the Brahminical classes and others of all kinds who existed, who have been sort of masters of being sly, I think, more than anyone else in the world. So what they have done is divide and rule, which is Spartan policy. So if you talk of Kashmir issue, the first question would be, what about Pandits? Right, that's a basic question. Very interesting now, I remember someone was saying something about Kashmiri, what happened to some young guy who was 20-year-old, writing, Kashmiri person writing about human rights abuse. Some said, why were you not speaking about Kashmiri Pandits in 1989, 1990? Now the guy was not even born then. So this what about Pandit issue, remember, in early 90s, and I was studying here in Delhi in early 90s, when the peak of insurgency was there, when the peak of resistance was there, armed resistance, and when the peak of state violence was there, most of us did not know about Kashmir. We were not aware. I remember going for marches on Palestine and going for marches on Burma, but we did not know much about Kashmir because Kashmir was kept out of popular imagination. Now what it has done, including what the media is doing now and the state is doing, is that it's bringing into popular imagination where, now I was talking to some of the friends earlier, where the auto driver starts asking you question, oh, is Umar Kashmiri, is Shehla also Kashmiri, what are they doing here, they're so thankless, and all of it. So in a sense, that is the lethality of the discourse now. What the Indian state and Indian media, broadly speaking, they have done is they have popularized the bigotry that allowed for violence against Kashmiris, and now it's going to be even more dangerous in the future. So now, violence in Kashmir, I'm someone who would not say yes or no, but I do not criticize, I do not support violence I do not support violence by the state actor, that's very clear. I do not support violence by the non-state actor, but I do not oppose them. I say I do not oppose them unless it targets the civilians. If I find, and I'm being very clear here, if it is state killing militants, militants killing state, I usually keep quiet because the idea is, for me, it's not the best way forward because Indian people get more killed. But wherever there's an attack on civilians, be it by the state or non-state, for me that's a problem. Now, when we take example of Kurdish movement, PKK and others, and we have seen within YPG in Rojava and other places, I mean, if we start talking of non-violence in that context, it becomes very unethical because they're facing battle of survival. My argument vis-a-vis Kashmir would be violence has been tried. Non-violence has also been tried. None of it has worked. But it's important that the movement, and again I'm not pre-movement, but it's important to understand why some would think of using violence. And if Indian nationalists or Indian people in progress don't want violence to be parcel of it, the first and foremost thing is to provide justice provide justice. But I said I would not, my problem with the violence as the resistance, again I'm not judging it, but in my analysis what happens is sometimes when you use violence against the state, or it's fine, but when you use violence against the civilians, and that's what happens, you enter into a situation where you've got civil war. And we saw that with JKLF and Hizbul Mujahideen in 1990s, and Indian state today. I'm saying Indian state today is much more powerful than what it was in early 1990s. Indian state has made it sure that the only sector that's flourishing in occupied Kashmir is the police sector, the security sector. So Kashmiris, if they want job, they have no option but to join the police. What would happen next if there's any kind of armed resistance? You have Kashmiris killing Kashmiris. So in essence, what Indian state has done is it has made sure that the next war, if there is a war in Kashmir, a violent kind of war, would become a very vicious kind of civil war. That is my part of the anxiety. But broadly, I said I would not make judgment about the non-state using violence against the state so long as the state is using the violence against the non-state.